Okay, well, hello again. Today we're going to talk about our last section as far as lectures in Chapter 11, and that is genetic linkage. And of course, this corresponds to Chapter 11, Section 5 in your textbook. So, let's jump right in here and talk about the chromosome theory of inheritance. All right, it's the chromosomes that segregate and sort independently during gamete formation. And if you think back to our last chapter, we got to talk about mitosis and meiosis. Well, if you remember, it's meiosis where this happens, and more specifically, the segregation occurs during meiosis 2, when we go from diploid finally to haploid for our sex cells. On a pair of homologous chromosomes, the alleles of the gene reside at the same location called a gene locus. So we take a look at a pair of homologous chromosomes over here. Now, you can see here that we have a gene for, or allele for purple flowers, and we have an allele for white flowers. Now, probably the individual this came from, this was their allele right here, would be heterozygous, but they would show the dominant, which in this case would be purple. But notice how both alleles and the locus for that flower color, the gene locus, is located here on each homologous chromosome. So, remember back to meiosis, and we talked about gamete formation. And organisms either homozygous, dominant, or homozygous recessive, or heterozygous for each gene. Okay? And the alleles carrying on different chromosomes are going to sort independently into gametes. As we can see here, we have a heterozygous, shows the dominant phenotype for both, but carries the recessive. And we have a homozygous recessive here that carries only the recessive for each one and displays the recessive trait. All right. So our dominants would be smooth and yellow, and of course rough and green. Well, when we do that and we get gamete formation, we end up with these combinations as you see here: rough and green. There's also possibility of rough and yellow. And of course we have smooth and green, and we have smooth and yellow. All right. So the offspring's genotypes could show as you see right here, and this gives us a phenotype ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. Let's talk about genetic linkage and crossing over. Once again, this was from last chapter as well too. We can see when the chromosomes form the tetrad, two pairs of homologous chromosomes, there can be crossing over that takes place. And of course, part of one chromosome is transferred and the other part of the other chromosome is transferred to that one. And we have a result of a crossing over. And of course, the genes that are carried on the same chromosome are often inherited together. And of course, this is what we call genetic linkage. But as you can see here, look how we have A and B very close together and C is very far on the bottom here. And once again, these are linked together, all right, and they're often inherited together, but crossing over can separate these linked genes. Let's say A, B, and C are all linked together. Well, as you can see, in general, alleles with the loci that are close together, like A and B here, will stay together. But because C is so far down on the end, and there's that possibility of crossing over, as we see here, all right, alleles that are farther apart from the other linked ones that they usually have been linked to, are more likely to be separated by the crossing over event, just because their loci is so farther away compared to the two that we have up here. If C were closer here, in fact right underneath B, the crossing over wouldn't have affected those linked genes. So let's switch gears here and talk about sex-linked genes. And as the name implies, it's related to the sex of the individual. It was discovered by an American geneticist, Thomas Hunt Morgan, in the early 1900s, and he was studying Drosophila melanogaster, otherwise known as the fruit fly. And we can see a couple pictures of them here. And I guess people really like to use the fruit fly because of the simple fact that probably nobody cares that you do experimentations on them. But they're very popular to use. They have puppy chromosomes and of course exhibit all the patterns that we see with our DNA, even though it's a little bit different. And they're very easy to experiment on. Normally fruit flies have red eyes, as we can see down here, but Morgan discovered that some mutant flies had white eyes, as you can see up here in the top picture. And he discovered, and oddly enough, he discovered that most of them were males. So that set Morgan into thinking, all right, about sex-linked inheritance patterns. There's about 2,000 genes mapped on the X chromosomes, and guys, hate to tell you, but there's only about a dozen that have been mapped to the Y. The Y really just determines sex. There's not much other information on it. In fact, my genetics professor in college called it a junk chromosome. So she was female too, so I'm sure she really liked that. But it is true, guys. So females, in this case, with anything that's sex-linked, must inherit 2 copies of the sex-linked recessive allele in order to express it. So they're going to need to get one from mom and one from dad. So that right there should send off a little clue that whatever sex-linked characteristic we're talking about, the father's got to have it, because males only need 1 copy of the allele to express it. Now, if they get an X from mom and a Y from dad, and it's not on the Y chromosome, remember, there's only like 12 genes on there. If it's one that's on the X and you get a Y and you get that recessive, you're going to express it. That's why it's so predominant in males. Females, they're going to have to get it from mom and dad. So if you think about that, mom has to be a carrier and dad must have that particular sex-linked trait. For example, going back to our fruit flies here, if you're female, look at that, 2 X's, you would have to get the recessive from mom and the recessive from dad, all right, in order to have a white-eyed female. For the boys, though, you get one from mom, doesn't matter what you're getting the Y from dad, that's what's making you male, you are going to express that recessive trait. And that's why there's so many white-eyed males that Morgan noticed versus females. So, let's take a look at some sex-linked traits in humans. Well, sorry, before we do that, let's take a look at Morgan's experiment, all right? So, Morgan's F1 generation. He took a red-eyed female, big R, as you can see, and then he took a white-eyed male. And, of course, he's got the recessive here on X, and the Y does nothing for this, all right? Just determines that he's male. So, you cross those two, and here's what your F1 can look like. And if you notice, both males have red eyes. They inherit that from mom. Both females still have red eyes, but they carry the recessive, all right? And that's the key right there. They're expressing the dominant trait, but they do carry the white eye recessive. So here was our initial. Here's our female with red eyes, completely red, and our white-eyed male. And of course, the next generation, that F1 right here, everybody's got red eyes, but this female is carrying the recessive. Male's still got red eyes. Now we cross them, and what comes out? Well, we get 2 females with red eyes, okay? We get a male, and remember, this female right here was carrying the recessive, but remember, the females have to get both of it. And since the male has red eyes, they're not going to get the other recessive from dad here. But the males, one of them will get mom's dominant for red eyes, but the other one will get the recessive for the white eyes. And of course, that's what's going to show up because they only get the Y from old dad here. So let's take a look at some traits in humans that are sex-linked disorders. And if you can see this over here and you can see the patterns in here, you don't have that first sex-linked disorder we're going to talk about, which is color blindness. It affects about 1 in every 100 males. All right, red-green color blindness or orange-blue color blindness, depending on what you see in here. All right, another sex-linked disorder is hemophilia. It affects about 1 in every 5,000 male births and 1 in every 20,000 female births, which is females are a quarter less susceptible to getting this sex-linked disorder. So, a complication in which the blood does not clot normally is what hemophilia is. Now remember, The only way a female could possibly get this is if her father would be a hemophiliac and the mom would be a carrier for it. Now, if both of them were hemophiliacs, well, I think you can figure out that everybody's going to get this disorder. But for males here, all it takes is the mom being recessive or carrying the recessive trait. All right. Doesn't matter about dad. Okay. If mom has the recessive, well, dad, he's either dominant or recessive. But if the mom carries that recessive, she's a carrier of it, the male has a possibility to get it. Whereas females, dad would definitely have to have it, and mom would either have it or have to be a carrier. All right, so that's sex-linked disorders. We're going to do a little work on this in class as well. Take a look at some sheets and make sure that we get this down pat. Remember to write down any questions that you may have. Bring them into class. Let us know what we can do to answer those questions. Okay? And that really concludes our chapter, besides pedigrees, which I think I'm going to put a few videos out on those as well too, just as examples as we work our way through them. And then we will be done with the genetics unit. Okay? Remember, write down those questions. Take notes on things you need to remember. And we'll see you in class.